To make psychological health and safety a priority in an organization will take more than conversation, interest, or even passion. It also requires expertise from someone with a background in mental and emotional health. We'll talk with a mental health professional who's focusing more on safety than ever before on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Safety at work is more than freedom from physical injury. To be safe, you have to feel safe. Join us each week as we discuss psychologically healthy and safe work in the USA. Well, welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. An overwhelming majority of the people in the United States seem to think that the country is experiencing a mental health crisis. According to a recent survey from CNN in partnership with the Kaiser Family Foundation, 9 out of 10 adults say they believe that there's a mental health crisis in the US. And according to some data from Mental Health America, between 2019 and 2020, 20.78% of adults were experiencing a mental illness. Now, this is equivalent to over 50 million Americans. Over 12.1 million individuals reported serious thoughts of suicide. 22.87% of adults who reported experiencing these mental health challenges, they suggest that they're having 14 or more mentally unhealthy days each month, and they're not able to see a doctor due to cost. As a matter of fact, in my home state of Georgia, which is ranked 51st in access, over a third of the adults experiencing frequent mental distress are unable to afford a doctor's visit. So while this podcast has been primarily focused on the impact of psychological health and safety in the workplace, this data makes it really, really clear that this issue extends well beyond the workplace into the homes, the communities, just the places that we are every day in this country. So in this episode, I thought it was great to bring somebody on who can talk about mental health in general, not just someone like me who's a safety professional who has an interest in mental health. But that's certainly not my wheelhouse, but we're in good stead in this episode. So the way that I introduce folks on the podcast is I jump right in there with a question. And so today, Georgia Bryce-Hutchinson is my guest. And my first question to you, Georgia, is who is Georgia?
Hi, Dr. Daniels. Thank you so much for having me. We've been planning this for quite some time, so I'm very happy that we were able to slow down long enough to get the ball rolling. Who is Georgia? That's a very loaded question, sir. Very loaded. I smiled when you pointed it out to me that this is one of the things that you were going to be asking, because this is something I ask my clients all the time. And it takes a lot to give a response on that. I like to say, from a philosophical standpoint, I am a direct expression of my creator. I think I'm a culmination of many experiences and stories that I bring to the forefront, from which I seek to serve my generation. In my former life, I was an environmental scientist for a while. For 7 years, I worked as an environmental scientist, and I shifted into environmental engineering, in which I worked in that field for about 9 years. And then I shifted over into the field of mental health, and I've been working in that arena since 2016. So I'm just a culmination of many stories, many experiences, but they all point in the direction of serving humanity. I am a private practitioner. I built the company Building Families According to Pattern, where I provide therapeutic services to couples, whole families, as well as individuals. And then recently, I've been getting more into mental health consulting and training at the corporate level. This is something that I'm very passionate about because I am a big advocate for mental health awareness. As you know, we've crossed paths at some of these industry conferences, and this is a very deep passion for me. I am a speaker, obviously. I'm a presenter. I'm an author. I'm a daughter. I'm a wife. I'm all of those things all wrapped up in one.
Wow. Wow. So you something I didn't know, or maybe you'd shared that with me and I forgot. So how does a person get from environmental science? What's the connection between environmental science and mental health?
Let me tell you,
how'd that happen?
no, it's just weird. I've always had a passion for working with people. And I'll tell you, when I worked in the environmental engineering in that world, I'd say the most exciting part of my job was the client relations. And I enjoyed working or interfacing with my clients. I think for a very long time, there were breadcrumbs indicating that this is the direction in which I needed to go, because I've always been the person people would come to for answers and problem solve, and I'm very solution focused. I have a desire to see people excel. And so even in my role as an environmental scientist slash engineering, I was doing a lot of more people oriented work. So what's the connection? You're dealing with people, whether they're environmental scientists, whether they're environmental engineers, whether they're people in the construction world, the manufacturing world, you're dealing with individuals. So I'd say somebody has to be able to bridge the gap. And I think my background helps to facilitate that. I have some insight into how that world operates, but now I'm bringing my skill sets from the world of mental health into this arena to be able to have impact, so that it's not just, I know Dr. Daniels, you talk a lot about psychological safety. It's not just physical safety where we've predominantly put our emphasis. Now it's bringing the psychological or the human piece to it. So yes, there is a connection. Whatever industry we're in, there's always a connection between when it comes on to mental health and working with people in various sectors of society.
Absolutely. So you mentioned it just in passing, but tell me, when you either first heard or when you now hear the term psychological health and safety, what pops to mind for you? What does that engender for you when you hear that statement?
Yeah. I'll be honest, for me, psychological health and safety means freedom. I think that's the one word that surfaces whenever I think about psychological health and safety. I think of freedom, being able to show up as my authentic self in a work environment, or any environment for that matter, where I'm able to be who I am and bring the best of me into that space. I also think about being able to give full expression to my potential without fear, without caps being in the environment, without being limited in terms of my creativity, in terms of my innovation. I've done a lot of research on psychological health and safety because, by virtue of what I do in the, interfacing with OHS and EHS professionals. And I think about just this desire to, everybody has the desire to just be the best version of themselves. Everybody wants to be able to show up at the table as themselves fully. And so when psychological safety is not present, you literally put a cap on that individual. And that in a sense becomes a source of oppression. It becomes a source of depression. It becomes a source of anxiety. It takes away from the essence of who you are as a person. So absolutely, psychological safety is one of those things. It's not just an industrial terminology or manufacturing terminology or an OHS terminology. I think that's across the board, any kind of work environment that we're in. That's very, very important. Absolutely. Very important for me. Yeah.
So I and the other, at least the other podcasts in this family, talk about the importance of both focusing on the organization and the environment that people are in. But something that you said, again, triggers another thought for me. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of both the person feeling safe themselves to bring themselves and the environment allowing or facilitating and helping that happen. So I think there are two sides. I just want to see what's your thought about the importance of a little bit of both?
I mean, you can't have people showing up being the best version of themselves or bringing themselves fully into the work setting without the environment being created to facilitate that process. Granted, we know people have their own intrapersonal or internal conflicts that they deal with. So the environment could be right, but the person has his or her own challenges that they're dealing with. And that's something that you have to work on an individual level. So that's the work that the individual has to do. But the environment can also help to facilitate that process. And so if we're not intentional with creating environments in which people can show up, even with their own idiosyncrasies, and still be able to function, still be able to get guidance, still be able to have room to grow or to evolve, it makes the situation even more complex for that individual. A lot of my growth, for example, took place on the job. It was, I've worked in different environments. It wasn't necessarily the most pleasant experiences that helped to facilitate my growth. But I'll say honestly, unequivocally, whether it was from a professional standpoint or from a personal standpoint, a lot of my growth as an individual occurred in a work setting, right? So leaders have to be willing to not only see their workers as just workers or just cogs in the system. I like to use that terminology. It's not just workers. You're dealing with whole people. And so apart from just setting infrastructure in place to make sure that work is occurring or that people are meeting their job, whatever skills that you hired them to do, and to follow through on their commitment in terms of work, you also want to be able to create an environment in which people are also growing, because if they are, then they're able to bring the best of themselves to work. And at the end of the day, it's just going to impact the organization. Both will win. The organization will win. The individual themselves will win.
Wow. That's pretty powerful. And so it now looks like you're actually working on both sides of that equation. Yeah. So you shared a little bit about your background as a therapist. Let's get into more detail. So again, how does an environmental engineer end up becoming a therapist? The steps you go through, because
I know it is a stretch, in all honesty, because when you think of it in terms of thought paradigms, it literally is the opposite sides of a coin.
Yes.
Both, right? The engineer is very logical, very rational, very black and white, very pragmatic. The therapist, it's more soft, it's more abstract, it's more, we like to use the term touchy-feely. Somehow I've been able to marry both worlds. Somehow I've been able to make that. It's not a transition, because I really believe I have both feet still in both environments. I still function very much as an engineer. I'm still very much logical. I'm still very much black and white. I'm still very much rational, still very process oriented in my thinking, still very systematic. And even with working with clients, I take that approach as a therapist, and it actually works. I think at the end of the day, Dr. Daniels, it comes down to valuing people. That's how I make the crossover. Because if you value people, no matter what industry or arena you're functioning in, valuing people, there's a way you go about relating to people. There's a way you go about treating people. So it's not that foreign, even though somebody may not be schooled. For example, you're not schooled in psychology as I am. But if you value people, you're going to show up and treat people a certain way that it doesn't require to be qualified as a therapist to be able to treat the individual the way the person wants or needs to be treated.
Right. Absolutely. Wow. And yeah, thanks for that encouragement to kind of continue. I'll be honest, some of the way that I deal with people, I learned from my mom. I watched her, and I continue to watch her. I share with people, she's one of the most forgiving people on the planet. I haven't quite got there yet, but it's watching the way she's, over the course of my life, interact with other people. You tend to like all mammals do, we tend to imitate behavior that we
Of course.
see. Um, but that goes both ways. That goes both ways. My observation is that a lot of the kind of negative kinds of environments that people are in, they're simply replicating or duplicating behavior that they've seen or experienced themselves. And so one of the things I do, and thanks a lot for participating, is I'm continuing this research around the kinds of hazards that people have been exposed to. So if can you think, think of some of the things that you saw in the survey? Can you think of a situation that either you or you observed someone else, a kind of a psychosocial hazard they were exposed to? And, again, your background being an engineer and now being a therapist, but you can look at that and go like, that probably shouldn't go that way. I don't need, you don't need background again in occupational safety and health either. I mean, to be able to recognize it, there's something about that doesn't look right. So can you
Exactly.
share, to the extent you feel comfortable, an experience that either you have or you're aware of someone else that had, that it went like this, but it probably should have gone another way?
Absolutely. I could talk about myself, and I had to kind of, you know, review or do a preview of the span of years I've worked for someone else. I've worked for other organizations because I currently work for myself. And one thing I think really stood out for me was the lack of constructive performance feedback and evaluation process. And I coupled that with the lack of encouragement and acknowledgement. That was a big thing for me. When I worked in an organization, I struggled with that tremendously. And I hated the end of the year, every year when we had this 360 performance evaluation, because the feedback that I would get, perhaps it was how it was handled, how it was conveyed, it didn't add value to me. Number one, it took from me, because here I was sitting in front of a supervisor who was giving me feedback from, I'd like to classify it, a bunch of people sitting behind computers, typing something about me. I don't know who it was, but it wasn't something that was necessarily pleasant. And at the end of the day, it often seemed to come down to not my work performance, but a difference in personality. So you were uncomfortable with my personality, my person. And that's what you were critiquing or criticizing, because then when you needed to provide, insight as to what was the course of action I then need to take to change outcomes, it was nebulous. There wasn't any concrete information that you could provide me with to say, Georgia, this is what we need you to do, A, B, C, D, in order to become better, so that a year from now, you're in a different space, right? So that was one big issue for me. I struggled with that. I dealt with that for a number of years. There wasn't any clear-cut goals established in terms of, all right, this is what we're wanting you to do. This is how we want you to go about doing it. And then there was no follow-up mechanism in place. There was no accountability. So I'm going to wait a year from now for you to come back and sit in front of me and provide more information, these numbers, comparing me to other people in the office, and still leaving me in this space of, okay, you're telling me these things, but what is it you want me to do? Now, I could tell you, Dr. Daniels, that was a very discouraging experience for me. And I'll tell you that it took from me as an individual. It eroded parts of my self-esteem working in that environment. The constant comparison to other people, not because of my work performance, but because of a difference in personality. And if I'm experiencing it, I'm almost sure that other people are also experiencing it. It's this idea of feeling marginalized or ostracized, and it didn't help me as a person.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I often, when I'm in these conversations with folks, I have to, kind of snap myself back, because I felt the same thing. I felt the same thing in, well, I would say probably every single solitary situation. Well, there's probably one exception. There's one exception. I actually had a supervisor. So he started off as a supervisor. We grew to, friends, and, unfortunately lost him not recently, but that's why he stands out, is the person who I really felt like was trying to help me the way I was.
Yeah.
And not trying to make me something that I was not.
Exactly.
And again, it really resonates when you say how we sit down for these ridiculous performance
Yes.
evaluations. And what makes them ridiculous? Here's part of the thing that to me makes them, and I'm going to editorialize here. What makes often them kind of ridiculous is the standards by which the evaluation are being given are nebulous.
Yes.
And even if the standards are clear and objective, people don't get trained on how to do it. And it's often, as you said, not really connected to performance in terms of the work. It is
Right.
presentation in terms of the person.
Yeah.
And you get people starting to even question themselves and wonder, and well, there's something wrong with me.
Mhm.
And I feel like any environment where I have to question myself, I'm in the wrong environment.
Exactly.
Really.
Exactly. And not knowing, and then not knowing who is saying these things or suggesting these things.
Yes.
And not understanding, why won't you sit and have a conversation with me? You've kind of reduced me to a set of statistics.
Right. Absolutely. So is it possible that those kinds of exposures, and again, a psychosocial hazard is a psychosocial factor that's perceived or experienced by the person as a threat to them that in turn motivates their behavior in some way? Do you see people in therapy that uh, the source of or part of the root of their challenge is that environment?
Absolutely.
Okay, so say more. Tell us more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, you cannot separate the person from the worker. This is something that I've been constantly in the environments in which I've had to present. This is something I've constantly shared, that you cannot separate the person from the worker. You're dealing with a whole entity. This is why we do total worker health, right? If you're addressing people, you are addressing themselves, the person, right? The personality, the essence of who the individual is. And if it's not in a light that is healthy or constructive, because there's nothing wrong in giving feedback, there's nothing wrong in even critiquing people. But if you're doing it in a manner that's not adding value or adding to the person's sense of worth, it is going to affect the person's internal disposition and their view of self. Once that starts happening, you're eroding at the individual. How will this person be able to show up on the job effectively and work well? Whether it's issues of microaggression that we talk about a lot, whether it's issue of implicit bias, perceived racism, listen, whether it's truth or not, it's the individual who's perceiving it and it's their truth. So it is going to show up in how they show up at work. I'm not going to be my best self in a work environment if I'm feeling this way. And if I'm perceiving in my mind that people are thinking these things about me, I'm going to come and I'm just going to want to do the bare minimum. I struggled with that. I struggled with not wanting to show up for work. And even if I did show up for work, I didn't want to interface with the people around me, which wasn't helping, because if you're in a work environment, a part of you being healthy is that you're able to relate to other people in a healthy way. Not wanting to, isolating, staying away because you're not knowing who's thinking these things about you, who's saying these things about you. Not feeling that your best is good enough, not feeling that you're functioning at the top of your game, because what is your feedback you're receiving has nothing again to do with your work, as it was in my case. So no, it affected me from a psychological standpoint. It made me anxious. And that's one of the reasons a lot of people tend to come to therapy. And it was a source of depression.
Mm.
So absolutely, there is no divide.
Oh boy. Wow. So I find it interesting that particularly here in the United States, that's where I live. And I'm finding it's a pretty universal issue, is that employers seem to respond much more quickly. So if you come into work and you have a cane because you've had surgery on your knee, they seem to respond to that a lot quicker than when you come to work and say, I'm just not feeling well. I'm not I'm not feeling it. I mean, I'm not. So what what advice or thoughts do you give to, again, on both sides, to the person who's experiencing that, and then to the organization? Because I actually believe that there are organizations out there that want to get this right. They do.
Absolutely.
They,
Absolutely.
but when they went to business school, or the person that they work for, or the environment that they've been in, that's not what they got. They got more of the command and control, and you got to be in charge, and that's just what they got. And I think there are people on the organizational side that are looking for different ways. So from the person's perspective and from the organization, what do you suggest to people who actually want to do this a little bit better?
So again, I really believe the idea of that total worker health approach is most poignant here, or most important. If you view your workers from the standpoint of being humans, as you are human, from the position of the leaders, no, you are leading an organization. Your organization is comprised of people who are just like you. Whatever your needs are, whatever it is that you're expecting to be able to function at the best or at your optimal capacity as an individual, the people who are working for you are needing the same ingredients, because we're human beings. It's very difficult. It's going back to what you were talking about earlier on, Dr. Daniels, about why is it we tend to respond more quickly to physical concerns than to mental or emotional concerns. I believe because physical, it's more tangible. I can identify if there's a burn. I can identify if there's a broken limb. I can identify if there's a cut. It's very hard identifying when there are intrapersonal conflicts taking place inside the individual. It's very hard to identify, or it's not tangible, when somebody's saying to you, I'm feeling depressed, or I'm feeling very anxious. It's very hard for that to, how does that look? Because that's more of a subjective experience. But the reality is, it's credible, and it is going to show up in how the individual is performing, and ultimately it's going to affect the bottom line of the organization. Because again, we know people call out from work more for depression and anxiety than they do for other things, right? So at what point in time do we come to terms with the fact that, you know what, maybe this is real? At what point in time do organizations come to terms with the fact that maybe we cannot keep ignoring this dynamic anymore? There is something serious at work here, because it's affecting our bottom line. I think about one of the reasons that really pushed me wanting to get more into the corporate setting to amplify mental health awareness. I'm at the end. I'm an end provider within the context of this thing. So I think about last year, for example, I had two individuals who came to me because they were dealing with significant anxiety. They were also dealing with suicidal ideation, and one of them had actually attempted suicide twice. Now, these individuals didn't know whether there was a system in place at work that they could have, whatever protocol was in place, to say, let me go to my supervisor and speak, let them know this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm struggling with, and the issue could be addressed. No infrastructure was in place as far as they knew. All that happened is that I had to immediately write leave of absences for these two individuals that perhaps expanded to about 2 months each. So your worker doesn't show up tomorrow morning, and for 2 months they're off the job. You as an organization, you're going to be scrambling to find somebody to replace that individual. That's going to cost you time. That's going to cost you money, right? If you're not intentional with putting systems in place to ensure that not only, again, are you dealing with, because we do very well with the physical health, we have medical stuff in place for our workers. If you're not intentional, just as intentional when it comes down to mental health concerns, you're going to run into these situations where we on the end are issuing out leave of absences, and you're going to be left scrambling to figure out what you're going to do when your worker is gone for 2 months. Again, it's not something that we could be lax with. And again, you pointed it out, Dr. Daniels, there are lots of organizations that are getting it. Kalila Gaya and I recently attended L'Oreal, the L'Oreal division in New Jersey, and we were able to do a 2-day training on mental health literacy and crisis response and intervention training. And kudos to L'Oreal. I have to big them up as far as that's concerned. And there are a lot of other organizations that are beginning to pick up on, you know what, we're excelling when it comes on to physical health and safety. We're going to have to start bringing the same weight when it comes on to mental health issues.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think the awareness is actually happening faster here in the US than it has in other countries around the world
Yeah.
because of what they have done that we haven't.
Yes.
So you've got all these examples of other places around the world who've been studying and researching and trying to come up with standards. They've done all this work. And we're kind of waking up from the pandemic going like, hold up, something's wrong.
Yes.
And people have started to notice that, well, hey, it's going on over there. And now I think there's some pressure, particularly for these big organizations that do business, around the world. They have to get this or they won't be able to attract great workers and talent.
Absolutely.
They won't be able to comply with the standards that exist. So there's this kind
There's a
of pressure.
cultural shift. There's a cultural shift that's occurring. And as much as we suffered because of COVID-19, I will have to say COVID-19 has been a gift that keeps on giving, because I believe what COVID-19 literally did was level the playing field when it comes on to this idea of conversing about mental health. It wasn't just the workers that were affected by COVID-19. People in leadership were also affected by it. So people are coming back into the work environment at different tiers of an organization, and now they're more aware of anxiety. They're more aware of depression, people who were impacted by, losing family members as a result of COVID-19, struggling with grief and loss, those kinds of dynamics. So people are coming back and they're saying, you know what? Mental health has always been there. Mental health issues have always been a concern, but now it's becoming more amplified. So because there are more people reporting issues with anxiety and depression, more of these individuals are showing up in the workplace on a daily basis. We can't afford to ignore it anymore. We have to be intentional with having conversations. And then I think in addition to the cultural shift that's occurring, I think hats off to my Gen Zs. I love my Gen Zs and my millennials because they are pushing, what do you call it? They're pushing the needle forward on this thing. They're saying, you know what? Gone are the days when the older folks would, you'd be, we call it in Jamaica, you're popping down and you're pushing to show up at work. You're ignoring the signs and the symptoms and the warning signs that are present that there is something going on with you. You would push past that. The Gen Zs and the millennials are saying, we're not going to do that anymore.
Right.
We're acknowledging that we're also struggling from a mental health perspective, not just physically anymore, mental health. And we're looking for organizations, we're looking for leaders who are going to be responsive in this regard. And if you as an organization refuse to do this, then we're going to find another organization that's going to be responsive. Right.
That I have to say, I really, really enjoy seeing this transition go on.
I do too.
I really do, because for those of us who have felt this way forever, honestly, and we were looked at as the oddball, and how come you can't just get along with people, and how come you just don't go along, and that type of thing. And you find yourself going, well, maybe I should, but I can't. I can't be someone that I'm not. Good. I can't. You come to this conclusion, and it's so good to see an entire generation, not these isolated cases of people who realize that you can't be your best somebody else.
Exactly.
I can only be my best self. I don't know how much you follow, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but there's an Endgame, so this is a bit of nerding out here for a second. So Thor goes back in time to find his to find one of the stones, and he actually gets to see his mom who'd passed away, and his mom tells him something. It's interesting how these movies can have so many little quotes and whatnot that really make sense. But she says, we always do a terrible job of being someone that we're not. We're going to do our best job at being ourselves.
Absolutely.
That's not the exact quote, but it's that essence. We can't be somebody that we're not. And we as individuals and as organizations should stop expecting it. Stop expecting people to be something that they're not. You hired people for their set of skills and their
Yeah.
ability to contribute to whatever it is you're trying to do, but they're a human being.
Yeah.
They have days that they don't feel good, and they have days that they're feeling really great and have more energy or less. And the question is, what are you doing in the environment you're creating to help that or to hinder that?
Yeah.
That's just really so important. And I really like, again, it's just interesting to have a person such as yourself who does have both the analytical, linear, sequential approach to things on the one hand, but also the, the touchy feely, because
Yeah.
it's not, I believe, particularly as I've had more birthdays, I'm not about binary choices anymore. I'm really not.
Yeah.
It's not this or that. It's
Yeah.
probably this and that.
Yeah. Both and.
Yes, both
So
and.
we
need a little
call
bit
it
of
both and. Yeah.
right. So again, you talked about the fact that you in your therapy sessions, you tend to do you tend to have individuals? Do you do families, groups? How does
I do individuals,
okay,
I do couples, and I will do whole families.
right. Have you found organizations asking you to do sessions for groups of people?
Not yet, but I'm not that's the direction, that's a part of the direction in which I'm heading, because I'm expecting that to happen.
Sure.
I'm expecting that to happen. I think as more organizations are coming on board or gaining more understanding of the need for this, that's going to be mainstream.
Yeah, and that was, kind of a leading question, because I was hoping that you would say that, because, a lot of people talk about how their organization is like family. They want, but what does that mean? I mean, because
Yeah.
people have different experiences, and
Mhm.
sometimes even the mention of family is traumatic for people, because
Mhm.
in my family, and on the other hand, people have these expectations. My family was so wonderful, and when you call yourself family, it doesn't match up with my idea of it, you're going to have some challenges.
Absolutely.
And one of those, one of the folks you may need to bring in is someone like you, really,
Yeah.
to sit with groups. I'm finding myself doing some similar. Again, not a therapist, but I enjoy talking to groups, but I also enjoy the kind of question and answer session after the fact.
Yeah.
Because that's when we really start to engage with people. And there are occasions where I go like, wow, as a safety professional, but there's something else going on. I probably need to have you. I have a friend I need to have you talk to. I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
that's, to me, that focus on total worker health
It
means
does.
if I, as a safety professional, so I go in to do an investigation of a physical injury, and I find out that there is a psychosocial root to it. And one of those psychosocial roots is the mental health of the person. Why do we just stop? Why don't we do something to try to help preserve that person? Because that work actually often is a lot cheaper than finding a new person. It really is. It really is. If we took the time to get them into, again, I was in the fire rescue service for a lot of years. And I'm of the opinion that virtually everybody I work with needs therapy. I do. I believe it. A lot won't do it
Yeah.
because of societal pressure and,
Stigmas that we still have to
stigma.
overcome. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And barriers too, because you mentioned something earlier on about being, when we were talking earlier about Georgia and people wanting help but not being able to access help. So that's the other piece. There are lots of people who want to get help, but can they access it? Perhaps you have the nearest therapist or provider being 50 miles away. Does the individual have a vehicle to get there? Does the individual have insurance to access a provider? Or if they're not able to, if they don't have insurance, are they able to pay out of pocket? So it's the stigmas that you're dealing with, but you're also having these barriers that you have to overcome for those people who want help, and it's very difficult accessing help.
You talked a little earlier, and something I wasn't aware of, I think, before we were recording. So I wanted to revisit it. There are occasions when you have to travel to other states because they have lack of resource, or
Recently,
share a
absolutely.
little bit about that.
Yeah, recently I was working in California. So I'm based in Florida, but quite recently California had a strike. Mental health professionals were on strike, including social workers, people in rehab centers, counselors, marriage and family therapists like myself, psychiatrists, psychologists. And so we were mobilized. A number of us were mobilized from across the country so that we could fill the gap, for want of a better word. And it was needed tremendously. When I found out that one of the reasons why the strike was on, as a matter of fact, was that workers were wanting the organization to bring in more workers because clients were not being able to see a therapist except every couple of months. No, when I say to when I came back, I said to my clients, I spoil you guys because I see you every week. And if you needed to see me twice a week and I was available to do it, I would. But then we're dealing with clients in this setting, for example, who probably would have access to a therapist once every 3-4 months. Imagine somebody who's in crisis. So imagine somebody who's dealing with suicidal ideation. And very interestingly, quite a few of the clients that I crossed paths with while I was on that assignment, they were seeking support because of psychosocial stressors at work.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Quite a few of them.
Wow. Well, there's really such a need. And
There is.
There's such a need. And it's really a shame that, in the richest country in the world, we have these kinds of situations where people, again, are in need of basic, I honestly believe I've kind of evolved on this thought. I didn't think about it before, but this is a part of basic healthcare. It really is basic healthcare. And I can make the argument again, from a safety professional kind of perspective, I'm coming to the belief that the psychosocial hazards, the psychological health and safety, the attention to mental health may be more important than the physical part, to be quite honest. Because if you can start to address things when I just felt something, rather than waiting until it actually happened, you could probably avoid some of the things actually happening.
Yeah, unfortunately, we operate in an environment in which we're less preemptive or proactive. We are reactive. So it's oftentimes when things have gone, the horse has gone through the gate, that's when we typically seek to respond. But you're right in saying, tending to mental health concerns early or putting it on the same level of priority as we would physical will benefit us in so many ways, because it would help to mitigate some of the physical issues that we're dealing with. I think I was reading earlier on about the U.S. Department of Labor sharing that most injuries on the job occur on Mondays. Out of all the days in the week, Mondays are the days when most injuries occur. It's the U.S. Bureau of Labor. And there are, of course, several reasons why that could be. But when you think from a psychological standpoint, I really believe it's a lot of when you're stepping out of the weekend into work mode, there's that psychological shift that has to occur. So it's more psychological than anything else. There are lots of things taking place in your life on the weekend.
Right.
You show up on Monday morning and you're having to transition, shifting in your mind. Lots of things kind of fall through the crack in between. People are coming to work, they're dealing with lots of issues, whether it's, dealing with divorce at home, dealing with caregiving at home, dealing with teenagers at home. So many different things are going on in the person's life. So again, coming to work, you cannot separate the worker from the person. So if I'm willing to deal with the individual as a whole being, and I create an environment in which that person is able to show up fully as themselves and to function healthily as themselves, then I also believe that will help to mitigate some of the physical injuries that are occurring.
Yes. I do have a bit of a bias. I have to be honest, but because I'm not really impressed with most EAP systems, but I'm just not. My experience hasn't been great. Yeah. But generally that's where people have to go. Is they have to go to quote to EAP. What's your observation? I mean, are you seeing some of those systems that actually do work? I mean, what component? How can that work better?
So EAP works when, number one, your workers are aware that the benefit exists. Most workers don't know, and it was so interesting when we were doing the training in New Jersey recently. That was one of the conversations that we had. when you are onboarding staff, new employees, you're throwing a bunch of information at them. And somewhere along the line in it, you may mention EAP, but they never hear about it again afterwards, right? So a worker could be working in an environment for years and not even be quote unquote aware that the benefit itself exists.
Mm.
Again, bringing in mind those two individual clients I was seeing who I had to put on leave, they didn't know of what their organization had to offer in that regard. They just sought out a therapist because their lives, they were at the brink and they could not go on as they were anymore. So most people are not aware that EAP exists. That's the first thing. Probably have to do a better job of ensuring that people are more aware of it. And I think the other thing I wanted to mention as far as that was concerned is that I think it's just like organizations kind of function like human beings. We just give the bare minimum. So we meet the minimum requirements, Dr. Daniels. So EAP, for want of a better term, meets the minimum requirements of perhaps what we tick the box. We tick the box.
Wow.
Unfortunately.
Wow. Yeah. So, oh my Lord. So, you're on today with a safety professional, and I know that you do a lot of work with other safety professionals. What was there a particular situation, circumstance, or thing that got you interested in working more with safety folks? Or how do you find the experience of hanging out with safety people?
So I'll answer your second question. I hang out more with y'all than I do my own folks.
Okay.
I'm running circles more with OHS and EHS professionals than I do actual psychotherapists. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I enjoy the environment.
Sure.
Again, I believe because my background is environmental engineering, so I was in that world for a while. So I think my comfort zone is there. In all honesty, it's easy interfacing with y'all. Okay. All right. How did I get into it? Very interesting. So Kalila and I met when I was an engineer. She was my client. She was my client. Yeah. So I had some work that I was doing on behalf of our organization, and she was the liaison at the time. And so we became very good friends. So we kind of maintained the friendship. We probably go back to about 2010, 2011. We maintained a friendship over the years. And so I think it was in the thick of COVID 2020. She reached out to me, and her push now is wanting to amplify again the mental health piece of safety, because again, you all have done an amazing job when it comes on to physical health. So she wanted an opportunity to start amplifying that aspect of safety in general. So she reached out to me and she asked me to write an article, first of all, for something that she was going to be doing. She wanted to quote that article. And then we had an opportunity to put together a webinar on behalf of BIES. It's an arm of ASSP. We did the webinar. She told me she was going to put a proposal together for the ASSP conference. And so we ended up presenting in 2021 at the ASSP conference in Texas. And then she also pitched our proposal to the NSC. So we presented to the NSC in 2021 in Orlando. And then we had another, we're on a roll. We're like, okay, look, whatever we're presenting or whatever we're pitching, there's room for it. People are open to it. We got another opportunity to present at San Diego recently for the NSC conference. And then we said, you know what, we're going to take it up a notch. She coined this terminology called the 5 I's. I'm not going to get into them because I don't remember all of them, but one of them had to do with amplifying mental health literacy in the work environment. And so recently, again, I had an opportunity to put together a manual that kind of helps to, bring the basic understanding of what mental health is without trying to make anybody into a therapist. Yes. But we were able to put together, I put together that manual, and we had that opportunity of going into L'Oreal recently and doing a 2-day training, full day, equipping people that we now call their emergency response team, but we now dub them mental health peer supporters.
Right.
And so we provided that training. They're certified for 2 years. And those individuals now have the opportunity to serve as like first line support systems for anybody who might be experiencing a mental health challenge or a crisis on the job. So it was almost like, I don't know, serendipity.
Yes. Yes.
And it works. You know, I particularly enjoy working with this arena because you already have the infrastructure in place.
Yes.
All you're doing is just adding the mental health piece portion to it, but you already have a system in place.
Yes. Yes. It is. Again, I don't know that that I'd heard that story before, because strangely enough, the room that you all taught in Orlando just happened to be the same room that I was speaking after you all. So
Oh,
that's how I
wow.
met. That's how I met
Oh,
Kalila,
wow.
because I think you had left for another presentation
Yeah.
because you all were back to back, and that's how I met her. And interestingly, she was one of my early guests on the podcast because I thought, and I'll go here, I thought I was the only Black person in the United States who knew anything about psychological health and safety. To be quite honest, I was still fairly new myself, but so her passion around the topic,
Yes.
and the fact that, you all are buddies and good friends, and all, it's encouraging. It
Yes,
really
it
is, because everything has to start somewhere.
Yes.
And it has to start with someone. Someone has to get the idea. And then as you take this passion to other people, you start to link up and you go like, oh. And before you know
You're
it,
beginning to find more people. Yeah.
that's exactly right. Exactly right. And I anticipate that there will be more that's going to happen in this space. And the other thing I have to say as we start to come to a close is it's encouraging to see the diversity of people involved as well, because many of the trends, fads, changes, what have you, at least in this country, they get started and people of color and women get left out.
Yes.
And I don't think that those systems work all that well. I've shared this with folks. I found this out in my research that the Occupational Safety and Health Act, when it was written in 1970, the 535 people that were a part of the 91st Congress that approved it were probably great people, but only 2% of them were women.
Wow.
And only 2% of them were people of color. That I'm able to, now there might be a couple others, but they didn't say it out front.
Right.
So now here we are 50 plus years later, we have a system that lacks perspective. It's not bad. It's done great work, but it lacks perspective. The OSHA Act still assumes that all workers are men. It uses that kind of language. His employer, his work, hold it. I mean, roughly half, and in some cases more than half the working population are women. So why hasn't that changed? And again, of the 19,670 words in the act, psychological is mentioned twice.
Wow.
So the act wasn't set up to do this, but now we're starting.
It was relevant for its time.
Absolutely.
And now it does need to be upgraded.
It
and
does.
The hope is, I'm hoping that it comes naturally.
Yes.
But I also recognize that whether we respond to the situation at hand or not, there's some things that are going to happen by force, because again, the people who are entering into the work world, aka the Gen Zs and the millennials, they're taking it by force. Like,
yes.
they're taking it by force. We see the trends playing out, whether it's soft quitting or quiet quitting or whatever you want to call it. It's happening. And organizations can't afford to sit comfortably anymore, because you won't be allowed to sit comfortably anymore, or else you will not be relevant. That's just the honest truth.
That's right. That's right. I say that, you may not like change, but you'll dislike irrelevance even more.
Absolutely.
Because that's what's coming. Yeah.
Yes.
So if there are folks who are either listening in, either wherever they get their podcast, or perhaps watching us on YouTube, or wherever they might see the video component of this session, how can folks get a hold of you?
Sure. So I am prolific on LinkedIn. I love connecting with people on LinkedIn. My handle at LinkedIn obviously is at Georgia Bryce. If you type Georgia Bryce, I should come up. Probably might be Georgia Bryce-Hutchinson at this point in time, but I think my handle is still Georgia Bryce. I also am on, for those people who are specifically looking for me as a therapist, I am on Psychology Today. pull my information up. I'm based in Florida, so I cover the entire state of Florida. I'm also looking now to get more into other states. So I'm preparing licensure to engage other states. If somebody needed to reach me via telephone, my number is 786-471-8312. Again, that's 786-471-8312. And I know you're waiting to hear about my website. I do have a website, but I'm updating it now. So I don't necessarily want to send people over to that because it doesn't fully reflect who I am at this stage of my life. Sure. For individuals, again, one of my thrusts is towards corporate, amplifying mental health awareness in the corporate setting. So if there are individuals who are looking to reach out, wanting additional information on that, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you to find out what the needs of your organization are, and we collaborate on doing something.
Georgia Bryce-Hutchinson, you are a superstar. Thank you so much for what you shared with us in this episode. I think folks are going to walk away with some things to think about. And again, if while they're thinking they need you, to get a hold of you, we've now provided that opportunity. And again, it's just exciting to be able to talk to folks like yourself who have particular expertise that I certainly don't have myself. I do okay, but as I said, I think we should get, people who have expertise in the areas where we need help.
Absolutely. I think at this stage, nobody needs to operate in a silo. It's not necessary. Right. Find the people who have what you want and collab. That's what Kalila and I do. I think we create a very, very good, we have a good team going or a good dynamic going. I know nothing about auditing. I'm not even going to try and learn anything about auditing, but I know what I know in terms of mental health, and bringing those two worlds together is definitely a win.
Absolutely. So again, thanks very much. I certainly enjoyed the conversation. And I just want to invite those, again, if you're watching or listening in, we're here every Friday with a new episode on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. You can follow us wherever you get your podcast. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. I do have a website. You can find that information out by following me on LinkedIn, as a matter of fact. It actually makes it easier. So again, thanks very much for the time that you've taken today. I've certainly learned, and I feel inspired and encouraged myself to continue this work. And so until next time, we will look forward to the next opportunity to share with you right here on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much. You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.